What's causing these extreme heat waves, and are they something that we're just going to have to learn to live with?
Um, I mean, heat waves are at some level a natural phenomenon. So you get a heat wave in Europe typically when you have high pressure, lots of sunshine, the air warms up, the soil dries out. But climate change, because it's increased the background temperature, makes the number that occur in, say, a decade more. So it increases the frequency of them in frequency. And so at the moment, I think based on earlier studies, I would say the heat wave we're seeing today or forecast for today is 10 to 100 times more likely than it would be in a natural world. And I'd also think it would be considerably more likely than it would have been, say, in the world that I grew up in the 1960s to 1980s.
What can be done then, Simon, to prepare for these kinds of extreme temperatures? We could see more of it over the course of the summer. We're only mid-July at this point.
Yeah, so in the immediate action, so in the sense we haven't really prepared infrastructure. So the things individuals can do is to essentially keep themselves cool, keep themselves hydrated. So drink water, keep out the sun, particularly in the 2 hours around noon, which in Britain is between 11 and 3. Look after, keep a good eye on children and infants and babies in particular, and elderly people. They're much more vulnerable to heat than adults are. Probably should avoid alcohol as well. So don't have a beer in the middle of the day. Would be my advice as a way of keeping cool. Drink water and keep out the sun. In the longer term, though, unless we reduce carbon dioxide emissions to zero, the climate will keep getting warmer and these heat waves will keep getting hotter. And these kind of events will become almost annual occurrences if we don't stop producing carbon dioxide emissions. And so that implies that as a society, we actually need to spend considerable money on adapting and preparing for climate change. So, I mean, we've already done that. Weather forecasts help a bit.
Well, staying on that topic, Simon, what about our climate goals? Have they been forgotten, abandoned at this point?
I don't know. It's hard to say. I'm not a politician or a political advisor. I was optimistic with the run-up to the last COP, where people were talking about keeping 1.5 degrees on target. And though it's worth saying, we're about putting that in context, the world has warmed by about 1 degree already, and we're seeing considerable impact of climate change already. Given the war in Ukraine, given, I think, the lack of willingness by our political leadership to, in some ways, be honest with people and say, look, we need to adapt. We already have to adapt. That'll be things that we would have to do. That cost money and time from people. But we also have to mitigate massively. And I think there needs to be a quite rapid shift to avoid serious climate change. And I think we're already in the wings of pretty bad climate change.
And speaking of the war in Ukraine, Simon, we've seen efforts by countries like Germany to tap new sources of fossil fuels, and that could undermine what's already a pretty fragile climate actions here in Europe. How concerned are you about what's going to happen over the course of the next few months, the next few years, if the war continues?
It actually depends on what the actions is and for how long. So keeping, say, a coal power station going over this winter on its own won't make an enormous difference. It makes it a little bit worse, but not much worse. The real thing is to think about, the real opportunity might be to say, well, we don't want to be dependent on Russian gas in Europe. We need to move to pretty much renewables and maybe some nuclear. Like France made these adaptations in the 1970s back into the oil crisis shock, which is why France has large numbers of nuclear power stations and actually per person emits less fossil fuel than most countries in Europe. So I think the adaptation is not to panic and figure out how to buy lots of gas, but to move to a system that's renewables. So, for example, in the UK, that would mean not subsidising the oil industry to go and look for more oil, but to put investment into insulation, to building more wind farms in the North Sea, to putting solar panels in pretty much everyone's house. And just think radically about a shift to a no carbon economy. And that way, it's win-win. We make our contribution to avoiding catastrophic climate change, and we also stop giving money to what appears to be a fairly unpleasant regime in Russia.